Hello traders, welcome to the Nexoel Trading Hub YouTube channel. So we're going to be looking at the weekly Forex forecast for the coming week. If you're new to the channel and wish to be staying updated with our weekly Forex forecast, you can do well to subscribe to the YouTube channel and also join the free Telegram community where you can have access to chart analysis and daily updates. So last week in the dollar index, this is actually the weekly time frame. We anticipated to see that price would come read this sell side liquidity because we have this fair value gap in the weekly time frame, this unmitigated fair value gap. So we anticipated first actually to see that price return into this inverse fair value gap before we have the push of price to the downside. But then price actually just returned a little into the inverse fair value gap, and then we had a massive fall of price to the downside. So what we can see here is that price have not yet mitigated the weekly unmitigated fair value gap. So in the dollar index, we are still expecting to see downward price movement in the coming week. We actually expected to see an up close week last week, but for this coming week, we're expecting to see that price is going to give us a down close week. So we are still expecting further push of price into the weekly inverse fair value gap. And then we see price project to the downside. So we see when price comes to mitigate the weekly unmitigated fair value gap. So let's check out the daily time frame. So here in the daily time frame, what we're going to see is we've seen the rate of the sell side liquidity, which were actually projected last week. And then we actually looked at this weekly inverse fair value gap from the daily time frame with a more broad perspective in regards to the sponsorship candle. We looked at this order block within the inverse fair value gap zone. And then we also looked at this breakout block because this sponsored the move that took out this buy side liquidity here. And now we have this massive fall of price to the downside where we have price imbalance in confluence to the weekly inverse fair value gap. So we are expecting to see that this down close candle that sponsored the up movements that raided the buy side liquidity, we're expecting it to reclaim price within the weekly fair value gap. So now we are expecting to see that Monday or Tuesday, we have this push of price to the upside where we want to see price mitigate the weekly fair value gap, and then we see the projection of price to the downside. So we're looking at price taking out previous week high points, either on Monday or Tuesday. So we're expecting up movements in the dollar index on Monday through Tuesday, or it could just happen on Monday, where price would read the previous week high, and then we see the push of price to the downside. Because what you can see is last week we expected to see price reaction here to the upside before the massive fall to the downside. But then price just gave a little push to the upside and then massively fell on Monday. And then now you can see we have price pulling back to the upside into the weekly inverse fair value gap. So we are expecting the rate of previous week high and then the massive fall of price to the weekly unmitigated fair value gap. So let's check out the 4-hour time frame. So here's the 4-hour time frame. If you can vividly remember, last week, I actually pointed out this fair value gap within the 4-hour time frame, which is also within the weekly inverse fair value gap. And now this fair value gap within the 4-hour time frame is now also an inverse fair value gap in confluence to the weekly inverse fair value gap. And here in the 4-hour, we have this fair value gap. So last week, I told us price was actually at this particular zone. So we expected to see that price would rise before price falls. But then price just continued the downward movement. So now we can see that price took out the sell side liquidity and now price is being rebooked by the inefficiency and the weekly inverse fair value gap zone. So we could see price mitigate the 4-hour fair value gap, which is in confluence to the weekly inverse fair value gap, and you can also see the 4-hour inverse fair value gap. So we could see mitigation of the consequent encroachment level, and then we see price falls to the downside after the rate of last week high points. So this is what we are actually expecting to see in the dollar index. So what you're supposed to do as a trader is now to actually wait to see price reaction within the zone in a lower time frame, and then you can frame your sell setup to the downside. Now what we can see is that price is reacting at this order block. So we could see this order block sponsor price movement to the upside to raid the previous week high point, and then within the lower time frame we frame the bearish buyers to the downside. So this is what I have to show us, guys, in the dollar index. So let's check out the EURUSD pair. So last week in the EURUSD pair, this is a weekly time frame, we actually expected to see price raid the buy side liquidity and then face mitigation at this weekly fair value gap, which is in confluence with this order block, before we actually see the push of price to the downside. Then what we can see is that price gave us the bullish movement to the upside, raided the buy side liquidity, mitigated the weekly fair value gap. But actually what we expected was actually to see that price push back to the downside first to this price level here that we are seeing here, which is the 1.08170 price level, before we see price giving us the bullish movements to the upside to come raid the buy side liquidity and mitigate the weekly fair value gap. But then last week price just took off, just the way price took off in the dollar index to the downside. So also in the EURUSD, we just have the massive bullish move to the upside, and then price took out the buy side liquidity, mitigated the weekly fair value gap. What we could see is that price returned to the downside and then mitigated this order block, mitigated the open price, and then price pushed to the upside. But then we actually had a down close week, because actually I told us if price should raid the buy side liquidity last week, we're expecting to have a down close week. We are still expecting to see that price continues in a bullish ride, but first we want to see price gives us a sell movement to the downside before we can frame the bullish move to the upside. So let's check out the daily time frame so that we can have a clear perspective to that. So what we are expecting in the EURUSD, this is the daily time frame. Last week we marked out this zone, expecting that price would actually return to the downside to mitigate this sponsorship candle, and then we have the bullish ride to the upside. But then price just continued and then mitigated the fair value gap, took out the buy side liquidity, and then price started pushing to the downside. So for this coming week, we're expecting to see that price may possibly continue to the downside into the sponsorship level, which I would consider as a breakout block, though we have this one here. So we could see price return into the zone, takes out last week low point. So we want to see price to return into the zone. Then we can frame the bullish momentum to the upside, expecting to see price come raid this buy side liquidity. So let's check out the 4-hour time frame. So here in the 4-hour time frame, we can see that price is giving us the bearish movement to the downside. You can see that price is reacting at this order block that left this fair value gap. So we could see for the push of price into this consolidation zone, and then we can look out to frame our bullish bias to the upside. So this is what I have to show us, guys, in the EURUSD. So this is just a quick one. I'm not dropping to more lower time frame. I've always told you guys, we're going to just give you a projection of what we are anticipating to see in the markets. So you actually utilize your knowledge that you have and then take your entry based on the smart money concept entry model or whatsoever entry model you make use of. So guys, if you're actually gaining value from our weekly Forex forecast and our other educational content, and you really want to be staying updated with our YouTube content, then you can do well to subscribe to the channel if you're actually new to this channel. Then you can turn on the notification bell so that when we upload new content, you'll be able to stay updated with those contents that have been made available. So guys, let's check out the GBPUSD pair. So guys, this is actually our GBPUSD pair. This is a weekly time frame. There is a little bit complication with the GBP pair it's not really clear in confluence to the DXY. So we are actually trading the GBP with precaution, because actually last week we expected to see the return of price actually. So the 50% of this candle week, and then we see price project to the upside to give us an up close week. But what we can see is that price actually returned, but then price raided last week low points and then gave us the up close week. So we expected the bullish push of price to the upside at the wrong time. So now this is now the weekly time frame, and then our anticipation to see what price is going to deliver next week. So we are still expecting a bullish ride to the upside in the GBPUSD, in confluence to the EURUSD, and in confluence to what DXY is going to be doing. But for now, the GBPUSD is not really in confluence with the movement we've seen in DXY. So let's drop to the daily time frame. So here in the daily time frame, what we can see is that we can see that price is not pushed to the upside to take out this high points for us to actually confirm that we are going to be in that bullish momentum to the upside. So what we saw last week was price actually gave us this candle. So we are anticipating to see that this may still further push price to the upside. But then price respected this sponsorship candle and further push price to the downside into this fair value gap. So price mitigated this fair value gap in confluence with this breaker, because we can see this is an up close candle, and then we have this down close candle that took out this low points. So price mitigated that. So we are anticipating to see that price may push further to the upside if the DXY is actually bearish. But before we see that bullish move in the GBPUSD pair, we want to see that price drops to the downside, and then we can begin to frame a bullish move. So let's go to the 4-hour time frame so that we can have a better picture of that. So here in the 4-hour time frame, what we can see in the 4-hour time frame is that price took out this low point. We have a run of this liquidity, and then we can see that price gave us this pullback. This is the up close candle that sponsored the down movement that took out this sell side liquidity, and then we can see price gave us this movement to the upside, and then we have this fair value gap. Now price is reacting at this order block, this fair value gap also. So we're anticipating to see price falls to the downside. Since we have the sweep of this sell side liquidity, price may react at this order block, and then we have the bullish move of price to the upside. But price have not yet given us a valid bullish structure. Price is still bearish. So we just have to really be careful, because price may decide to still further push down and sweep this low points before we have the bullish structure being formed. So, but we are still anticipating to see that price drops to the downside. Now we could look at lower time frame to see what we can frame from this order block before we can now really consider going bullish in the GBPUSD pair. So guys, let's check out the gold pair, and then we check out the USDJPY. This is gold from the weekly time frame. So last week we actually expected to see a bearish movement of price to the downside before we see the bullish move of price to raid the buy side liquidity. So we actually saw price really respected our sell zone, and we had a clean sell movement of price to the downside. But then for the buy movement, we had a raid of stop loss, because we never expected price to actually raid this low points, where you see price return raided it. And I told us we were expecting to actually have an up close week for that week. So last week we had the up close week, and then we're still expecting for the push of price to raid this buy side liquidity, because we can see this order block. Price respected close above the order block. So we have this internal sell side liquidity. We have this fair value gap. So I'm not really looking at price returning deeply into this. I'm expecting to see price raid the buy side liquidity in the gold USD pair. So let's check out the daily time frame. So this is the daily time frame. What we saw last week was this fair value gap. So we expected to see price return and then price respect this down close candle. And then we see price push to the upside. But then what we can see is that price raided the low of this down close candle before we had a bullish move. So we caught the sell move based on the 4-hour zone that we mapped out, and then price dropped to the downside. So we are still expecting to see price pushes to the upside to raid this buy side liquidity and possibly also this buy side liquidity. So we have this price inefficiency here. We have this fair value gap. So we could see the open of markets for the coming week. Price would return to the downside to mitigate this fair value gap, and then we have continuation of price to the upside. So let's check out the 4-hour time frame. Here in the 4-hour time frame, what we can see is that price took out this internal range sell side liquidity. Price swept through it. So you can see we marked out this inverse fair value gap last week, expecting to see this bearish movement of price. And then you can see that neatly happened. And then we were trying to frame the buy move, but then price took out the stop loss. So you can see that now price is pushing to the upside. What we have here is that price left this inefficiency here. Price now has mitigated this fair value gap here. Price has mitigated this fair value gap. And then we can see how price is failing to close above the fair value gap. So we could see price return to the downside into this price level. That is the 2402.85 price level. And then we see price push to the upside, anticipating the first rate of this buy side liquidity and then an extension of price to rate this buy side liquidity. So this is what we're expecting to see in the gold pair. We have this mitigation block here, but then we can see we have this movement, price return. We have this up close candle that sponsored this down movement, and this is in confluence to this fair value gap zone. So we could see that price would actually face rejection at this zone, and then we can look out to frame our bullish bias when price return into this zone. Except price fails to respect the zone and then breaks through. We were looking at this zone to actually frame a bullish bias to the upside. So this is what I have to show us guys in our gold pair. So let's check the USDJPY pair too. So during last week forecast, we actually anticipated to see price raid this sell side liquidity last week. Now we can see that price actually raided the sell side liquidity because we also saw this weekly fair value gap. And we anticipated to see the reaction of price at this fair value gap. Then we framed the bullish movement of price to the upside. So now what we can see happened is that last week I actually told us to anticipate to see price pulls back into this weekly inverse fair value gap. Then we look forward to frame the bearish movement of price to the downside. But what we can see is that price actually pulled back a little, but then price did not really return into the weekly inverse fair value gap. And then we had a massive fall, and then at the end we have up close week, because I told us to actually anticipate up close week after price mitigates this weekly fair value gap. So now what we are still anticipating in the USDJPY pair is still more bearish momentum, but we're going to have a bullish ride of price before we experience any form of a bearish push of price. So let's check out the daily time frame. So here is the daily time frame. Here's that sell side liquidity we identified in the weekly time frame. Price raided through and then mitigated the weekly fair value gap. So you can see now we are having price pushing to the upside. So we're anticipating to see price get booked by this weekly inverse fair value gap. So I'm still anticipating more bullish push of price to this inverse fair value gap. Then we frame a bearish move of price to the downside. So let's check the 4-hour time frame. So this is the 4-hour time frame. So we can see price push to the upside, return price for the push, swept this. Now we can see prices reacting at this mitigation block because this failed to sponsor for the push of price to the downside. So we could see price continue the movement to the upside because right now we can see price filled up this fair value gap. So we could see price continue the movement to the upside into the weekly inverse fair value gap. Or we could even see price may possibly raid through this zone to take out this buy side liquidity and then mitigate this other block. Then we frame the bearish bias to the downside. Except otherwise, we could see that price may actually fall, take out this sell side liquidity to fill up this inefficiency, and then price gives the bullish ride to the upside before we frame the bearish move to the downside. So this is what I have to show us, guys, in the USDJPY and in the weekly Forex focus for this coming week. So guys, if you're actually new to this YouTube channel and want to be staying updated, then you can do well to subscribe and also join the free Telegram community. So I do not really go into far lower time frame because this is just to give you a focus, and then you actually utilize the knowledge you have to actually execute the trades if they are in confluence with what you've analyzed for yourself in the markets. So till I see you guys next week in our next week weekly Forex focus. Cheers guys, stay blessed and trade profitably.